In this tutorial, we are going to take a closer look at structural directives. Out of the box, Angular provides us with a bunch of structural directives, such as ngIf or ngIf. But how do they work behind the scenes? We are going to find out in this tutorial by implementing our own ngIf. To get started, we are going to create a new my-ngif.directive.ts file. In this file, we are implementing a simple Angular directive. In order to access our directive, we need to give it a selector. The selector is a normal attribute selector. Before we can actually use our directive, of course, we have to add it to the declarations array of our app module. At this point, we are ready to use the my-ngif directive on any given DOM element or Angular component. At this point, our directive does nothing. And also note that we are using it as a normal directive and not as a structural directive. At its core, a structural directive is just a simple attribute directive. But as soon as we prefix it with an asterisk, it turns into a structural directive. So let's find out the difference between an attribute directive and a structural directive. Let's add a constructor implementation where we inject the element reference and print it to the console. If we now explore the console, we will see that the native element of the element reference is our h1 object. What happens if we prefix our directive with an asterisk and turn it into a structural directive? There are two things happening. First, our h1 is gone. Second, the native element turned from h1 to comment. What does that mean? Let's explore the DOM. And we will see that instead of rendering the h1, it rendered a comment called container. There must be something special with this asterisk. So what's happening here is as soon as you prefix an attribute directive with a star, Angular behind the scenes wraps your component or your DOM element with a ng template and applies the attribute directive on it. If you're familiar with ng template, you already know that ng template is just a container that holds a template, but actually it doesn't render anything to the DOM. To render this template to the DOM, we need to extend our my-ngif directive. Instead of getting a hold to the element ref, we will now get a hold to the template reference. To render the template, we need some further mechanism. We need to inject the view container. Once we have the view container, we can use its createEmbeddedView method and pass the template to render the template to the DOM. If we now refresh, we will see that our h1 element is rendered again. But hold on, we are still using ng template with an attribute directive. So let's revert that and apply the directive directly on the h1 and turn it into a structural directive. Guess what happens? Nothing. It's exactly the same as having it wrapped with an ng template. So this is the magic behind this asterisk. The asterisk wraps your component or DOM element with an ng template and applies the attribute directive on it. In our case, this is not yet enough. We want to also conditionally render the template. To conditionally render the template, our directive needs to accept an input. Note that the input name needs to match the directive name. This allows us to pass the condition when applying the directive. If this name differs, we would need to add another input property on the host. Great, our ngIf directive now accepts a Boolean flag. Based on that flag, we now want to render the template or we want to remove it from the DOM. And of course, we don't want to do this once initially, we also want to be able to react on changes. Since we are talking about changes, it makes sense to do this in the Angular onChanges lifecycle hook. Inside this lifecycle hook, we create a new check that checks if the my-ngif flag is true or false. If it is true, we render the template, and if it is false, we then call viewContainer.clear, which removes our template from the DOM. We can now pass a Boolean as an input property. If the Boolean is true, our template gets rendered. If it's false, nothing gets rendered to the page. Let's also check the dynamic scenario. To do so, we add a render property, which we set to true. Instead of false, we now pass this render property. And we also add a button that toggles the render property. In the onClick listener, we will simply toggle the render property. Initially, the render property is true. Therefore, our ngIf directive renders the h1. Once we toggle it to false, our ngIf reacts and removes the h1 from the DOM. Once we turn it back to true, it gets rendered again. If you enjoyed this video tutorial, make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and to follow me on Twitter. Till next time.